to show you how to make this jacket.
We're going to press under the first centimetre there with the first notch, and then the second notch, which is this one here, we're just going to press under that again. I don't know if you're feeling a bit daunted by sewing a jacket. It feels like a big task, doesn't it? But once you get started on just the little one stage at a time, it suddenly feels much more manageable. So don't worry, because it really is straightforward, and you can do this. Now we're going to sew a stitch around the curved edge, so here, which helps us to press it in, needle down, foot up, all the way around there. Use that stitch you've just done as your guide, and make sure that it's not showing on the other side. It's quite difficult when you've used such a well matched thread. And just pleat this under as you go around that curve. You should be able to press under a very lovely curve. Grab your facing pieces, which is this one here, which is the back of the neck, and then these two here, match them up at the shoulder seam here. Stitch a straight stitch across there. I did back stitch there actually. That's our second shoulder seam on the facing. What's next? This is the outer edge, this is the neck edge here. So I'm going to sew a tight stitch, centimetre in from the edge, and I'm just going to stitch all the way round the edge. So now we're going to sew all the darts. We've done the pockets and we've prepped the facing. There's one in your back piece here, in your sleeve there. There's also the bust dart, which is there. Pinch this together with the right sides together, match up your notches, pinch where the point is, and then I'm just going to put another pin here where the end of the dart is, back stitch at the beginning. There's lots of different ways to do this. If you want to chalk mark it so you can actually see your line where it is, you can do that. Or you can actually use this thread here where you started stitching. You can actually, you put your needle down, use that if it's long enough. Mine's not quite long enough, but you can sometimes use that as a guide as well and just stitch over it till you get there. So I found my chalk mark, it's here, and like I said, I'm just going to go about a centimetre beyond it until I've gone right off the edge of the fold. Open that out and press all our darts, and press that nice and flat on both sides really. I'm going to top stitch my darts because it's a jacket, about 2 millimeters away from the actual seam, all the way to the edge, to the point. Tiny little back stitch there. There we are. That's our top stitch dart. Looks really nice. I'm going to do a run and fell seam. You don't have to do this. It does look really nice, especially on a jacket, and because the jacket isn't lined, it is gives it a really nice flat seam. If you don't want to do this, you can just do a closed seam. We're going to do one down the centre back, another one on the shoulder, and then the side seams of the front and back will also be machine fell. So here goes. I've got my front piece and my back piece, you can see here by the dart, and I'm matching up the shoulder seams, yeah, and then Make sure you get your measurement on your machine at 1.5. We've got the notches there as well to help you to see where to stitch. So that's just a regular seam. If you want to do all your straight seams first, because you're going to have to do this on every seam, you can go and do that. Trim one of the seams to half. I'm only cutting through one side. Press the longer seam allowance over the cut one so it just starts to meet the stitching here. So we're at this stage. Open the seam right up and you're just going to press the whole thing over to one side. Make sure it's nice and flat. The closer to the edge you stitch, the better, because you haven't got an awful lot tucked in here. So if you stitch too far in, you're going to miss that little fold there. This is the inside, so it looks like a double row of stitches on the inside, and then on the outside we get this gorgeous row of top stitching there. So now I'm going to do the same on the other shoulder, the same down the center back seam, and the same down. I'm going to sew up my side seams. When you come to the side seam, you've obviously got this big dart here, so trim off the seam allowance that has the big dart in it. I'm sort of pulling this and tucking that under all at the same time. This is the dart bit that I was talking about. So make sure you don't skimp on that 1.5 seam allowance in the first place either, because this is where you really need it on these really chunky bits here. Grab your undercollar, that's these two pieces here, and literally we're just going to sew this as a centre seam here. This piece as well is ever so slightly smaller than the top collar. It helps to make the collar fold over really nicely to have this piece slightly smaller. So I've pressed this open. I'm going to put the top collar down first, and you'll see what I mean about the sizing. Still match up your edges even though the undercollar is slightly smaller. Matching there. Nearly done. And that one there. The seam allowance, very important here, is 0.6 centimetres, which is basically the edge of your foot. Nice and easy. So the reason for that is that when we turn it inside out, we don't want too much seam allowance to it gets a bit bulky, especially around these lovely curvy bits here. Right, so keep sewing all the way around to the other corner here. Slightly bag it out, which means turning it the right way round and pushing your finger in to really get the seam right on the edge. But before I finally do it, I'm going to do an understitch. So again, it's on your glossary. It's quite fiddly because we're trying to get into this corner. Don't worry too much if you can't get right into the corner. Basically, understitching helps the seam allowance stay on the right side and also helps the undercollar to just sit underneath where it's supposed to be. Okay, all the way along there. It's a lot easier on the straight edge. Go all the way along as far as you can into that corner. Not quite done with the collar. One last thing, we're just going to close this seam shut with like a stay stitch. We're going to pin and match up your collar to this neckline. Now we've got lots of notches here to help you. there's two quite close together. This one is for your matching up with the shoulder seam, so let's put a pin in there. We're getting quite thick. And there's another one really close by which matches up to the dart. All pinned and ready to stitch. 1 centimetre, or actually the line that you've done your stay stitching, we've got another row of stitches when we sew the facing on. We're nearly there, look. Collar, jacket, facing, very satisfying. All of this needs to match up all around here to here, around the neck and back down again. I've bent a few pins, did you? Yeah, it's getting really thick now around that collar, but that's as thick as it's going to get. So I've started stitching. I've stitched up here, 1 centimetre seam allowance for this bit, but here we have to go back to 0.6 centimetres because of the curve and when we bag it out. So when we come to the step, we're going to continue with our 0.6 seam allowance, needle down, then turn, and then what you'll see is you've got your 0.6 here, and then this step you just carry on sewing in a straight line, and that is then going to give you your 1 centimetre seam allowance. Tricky in places, wasn't it? Snip off the corner. Don't cut your stitches. If you do, don't worry, just stitch over them, so that when I turn that inside out, bag it out, I'm going to have a nice sharp corner and basically snip into this seam allowance so that it has some give. Make sure you've got scissors that are sharp right to the tips, because you want to avoid cutting like this, because cutting through a lot of layers you could quite easily slip. So just snip to the end of your scissors up to the stitching. If you can't do all the layers all at once, just go through them 2 at a time. I'd say about every 5 centimetres to start with. Turn it inside out, bag it out, see if it sits straight. If it doesn't, add more snips in between. So I finished my snipping, so start bagging this out there, push the corner out all the way down the side of the facing, and then press the whole thing down. We're going to press under the hem, and we're going to hem the jacket at this point as well. Press under 1 centimetre, then 3, just like we did on the pockets. I'm now pressing the facing all around where the collar is. Just going to put my pins in while I'm on the ironing board, and I can get it nice and flat. You can always adjust it when you get to the sewing machine as you're stitching. Match up your shoulder seams of the facing with the shoulder seams of the jacket, and keep going all the way around until the hem is pinned and the facing is pinned. Hem, I'm starting at the centre back, just because that's where the join will be, because you're going to sew all the way around the hem, the front, centre front, round the back of the neck and back down again until you come back to the beginning. Okay, one of my favourite bits now is the top stitching, which is the final bits, the finishing touches. So I'm starting at the bottom corner, right near the top stitching here, the corner here. I'm just going to do a little row of stitches, about 3 stitches to start me off, till I get to about a foot's width away from this edge. So back stitch, then back up to my foot's width. Is that it? Just pivot round, that should be fine, and then head off all the way round this edge, the top, the centre front, and round the collar. That's the detail where you start, and then this important detail here on the, just when, as if in case you're wondering where to stitch, how to stitch this collar area here. Doesn't it look gorgeous? It's time for the sleeves. We're just going to, as usual, press under the hem first, so that's all ready and waiting and all nicely pressed when the sleeve's stitched up. So 1 centimetre, then 3, and just follow the notches on the side, right sides together, and I'm going to stitch 1.5 seam down the sort of underarm of the sleeve. Now I'm going to do a very fiddly bit here, and if you don't want to do this, you can just at this stage just zigzag this raw edge and then press it to one side, and if you want to top stitch it after that you can. But if you're up for a bit of fiddly work, then it is doable. Watch this. So you're going to do your usual cutting off of half the seam allowance. Make sure you cut the seam allowance that has the dart in it so that it's not too bulky. So I've trimmed my seam, and then like before we're going to just wrap the back seam over the front until it meets the stitch line. It's all in the ironing, it really is. If you press it well and it stays while you're stitching it, that really helps. Tuck that right under. So here we are, starting right at, this is basically the underarm end of the seam, not the cuff. All right, let's do this. I'm pulling, like I did before, I'm pulling the seam out and I'm tucking this under, all at the same time. Again, sewing right on the edge of the fold. So here goes. And as you start stitching, this is going to start wrinkling up around the foot, but that's okay. I'm starting to sort of get right deep into the sleeve here. Keep sewing. My second one was a lot better. So anyway, let's give ourselves a little break now and do an easy bit. If you did want to have your sleeves longer or shorter, by all means make it the right length for you. That's what these kits are all about. Top stitch that all the way around as usual. We're going to set the sleeve in now. It's all hemmed and stitched up. So to ease the sleeve head in to the armhole, we're going to sew a tight sort of an easing stitch on the sleeve head, which is basically the bit between this notch and these notches here. Don't backstitch, because we're just going to pull this stitch to tighten up that sleeve head as we try to fit it in. So I'm going to put my sleeve my stitch length, onto the longest stitch length and just whiz round. It's going to go quite fast because it's a long stitch all the way around the sleeve head. So I've reached the other notches here. I'm just going to leave it there. Setting in a sleeve. Okay, I always work on my lap when I'm setting in a sleeve and pinning. So you've got your jacket here. I've turned my sleeve right side out and I've sort of slotted it into the armhole. So it's just sitting there like that, right sides together. Okay, there's various matching points here for you. So you've got the underarm seam, you've got the notch here that matches up. Make sure you've got the right sleeve in the right armhole. So the single notch should match up with the single notch, which is the front of the jacket, and the double notch is the back of the sleeve and the back of the jacket. So that's all there. You've also got another notch here which matches up with the shoulder seam. So first of all, I'm going to pin together all the notches. Okay, so that's my 4 matching areas. Now this bit is under the arm, so this is fairly well fitted and flat. So I'm just going to put 2 pins in there. Right, now I'm coming around to the sleeve head. I'm just going to move this around on my lap. This is the sleeve. It needs to bunch up and ease into this flat section here. So this is where we use our easing stitch. I'm just going to pull on that and sort of start to slightly gather it. It fits, okay? This puckering here will disappear. This is literally on the seam allowance. So the actual where the easing stitch is fairly flat, okay? When you're stitching that, try not to incorporate any actual pleats or gathers, okay? More pins. Right, last one, and now I'm ready to sew this. 1.5 seam allowance, so straight stitch. Don't forget to shorten your stitch length back to 2.5 or 3 if you just did your easing stitch. Make sure the sleeve is the underneath bit. It's easier to sew that way. Checking that I haven't got any pleats developing or actual bumps in the gather. Now just go around the raw edge with your overlocker or your zigzag just to finish that edge. Now is all the fun stuff. I'm top stitching the shoulder. I've pressed the seam towards the jacket. It's 10 centimeters down from the shoulder on the back of the front. So I've just marked it with a pin. 3 stitches there, and then so yes, it's 1 centimetre all the way around the top of the shoulder. Okay, it's time for the pockets. So you'll see on your jacket lots of chalk marks actually. So grab your pockets, put the tops of the pockets where these 2 chalk marks are, just so they're just covering the chalk marks. This one will go there. I always put my pins somewhere that I can leave them in while I'm stitching my pocket, because as you're stitching, the pocket tends to sort of move around. Stitch a rectangle or a triangle, and this is the fun part where you just get to have a little play, whichever you want to do. It's up to you. I'm going to do a rectangle, so I'm going to start at the place where I stitched it down. Start with your back stitch. Swing that round. It's great if you can get really precise with your stitching, even if you have to do the hand wheel and sort of wind it by hand to get the stitches exactly in the right place. It's worth it. And then basically it's straight down and around the edges. Tuck under the seam allowance as you go along. You'll have a buttonhole marker in your kit, which will be this section of the pattern. 5 places to mark out for 5 buttons. They're about 10 centimetres apart. There'll be a cross, and then there'll be a little marker about 1/8 of an inch. The 1/8 of an inch to the outer edge marks where your buttonhole should begin. You'll do your buttonholes across there. Okay. Cutting through your buttonhole, put a pin just before the end, because you're slicing through a fair bit of cloth. Get your unpicker. Make sure you've left yourself enough space to cut through, and begin to slice between the stitches. That pin just there will prevent you from overshooting. Done that many times. And then come back from the other side and finish off. Buttons. Ace, you are brilliant. Well done.